Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to wrap up Unit 7 by talking about Roosevelt's foreign policy, the rise of the America First Party, and our attempts to sort of navigate the increasingly complex global situation in the late 1930s. So let's dive in. We'll get to see a lot of Dr. Seuss cartoons today, and we'll get to talk about Roosevelt's tap dance, about how, to balance not getting us into war versus pushing back against German and Nazi aggression. So here's our objectives for today. Take a moment, pause, and we'll move forward. As you hopefully remember from your world history class and from earlier in this class, the Japanese have been expanding pretty aggressively during this time period. The Japanese had modernized their society in the aftermath of the Meiji Restoration and the Perry Expedition, and were pushing to create their own sort of territorial empire. They saw this as necessary because without the raw materials established, or the raw materials that they'd be able to secure with territories in Korea and China, Japan would always be beholden to foreign powers and would never be able to be sort of on the same level as the various other European, imperial powers that they were competing with. As you hopefully remember, the Japanese had already annexed the island of Taiwan in the aftermath of the First Sino-Japanese War, and had made Korea a protectorate and then annexed it in the aftermath of the Russo-Japanese War. Now Japan is looking for the resource-rich area of northern China known as Manchuria. But the Japanese do not want to be seen as sort of nakedly and aggressively expanding. And so the Japanese army is going to stage something called the Mukden Incident, where Japanese army officers plant a bomb and assassinate the Japanese ruler, or the Japanese supported ruler of Manchuria. They assassinate this Chinese warlord and then use this as an excuse, basically saying that, well, the Chinese can't control, their northern territory, so we're going to have to step in and administer it. And so that leads to the Japanese army moving in to take over Manchuria and greatly expand Japanese power. The Chinese do push back against this, fighting back against the Japanese, but the problem is China is pretty divided at this point. The Kuomintang, the party that was attempting to unify the nationalists and the communists, really fell apart after the death of Sun Yat-sen and with the rise of Chiang Kai-shek. Zhang, as you hopefully remember, attempted to purge communists from the Kuomintang, and after the whole Shanghai massacre, pretty aggressively started attacking the Chinese communists as opposed to pushing back against the Japanese. And so it's really hard for allies of China to see who to support here, because on the one hand, we like Zhang much more than we like the Chinese communists, but Zhang is much more interested, again, in his encirclement campaigns against the Chinese communists than he is against fighting the Japanese. So who do we back in this war, and how do we back them? In the end, we mostly back the Chinese nationalists and ship weapons to them, but they're much less effective at fighting the Japanese. And so this is going to be really problematic for us going forward, is trying to find an effective ally in China to push our interests forward and to push back against Japanese encroachment. The Japanese pretty effectively create a puppet state called Manchukuo, where they put the former emperor, the last Qing emperor Puyi, on the throne as sort of a Japanese puppet. When the Qing dynasty collapsed, he had fled to Japan, and so they're going to put him on as a puppet, arguing that Japanese occupation is going to usher in sort of peace and tranquility. And the Japanese are really focusing on this vision of creating an Asia that's safe for Asians under Japanese leadership. Although, unfortunately, they're not going to do a good job at following through on this, and we're going to see some real unpleasant Japanese treatment of prisoners. In the end, the next sort of staged incident is what's called the Marco Polo Bridge incident, where some Chinese and Japanese soldiers get in a fight at the Marco Polo Bridge in the city of Shanghai. This is going to lead the Japanese army to move in, occupy, and attack the city of Shanghai, setting forth, really expanding the war into sort of central China, right along the Yangtze River Delta. And so the Japanese are going to continue to aggressively expand into China and take more territory. This is problematic to us because there's a U.S. consulate here. There's also an international settlement and a whole bunch of Europeans living in the city of Shanghai, as you hopefully remember from your world history class. And so there's a lot of foreigners watching all of this urban warfare go down and who are pretty horrified over the cost of all of this and the treatment of the Chinese. Eventually, China is going to mostly collapse. There are still going to be nationalist fighting to some extent, but as the Japanese move up the Yangtze River and eventually take the city of Nanjing, we're going to start seeing mass atrocities committed by Japanese soldiers. The Japanese are going to regularly kill prisoners, and especially the treatment of the Chinese in Nanjing is going to create a massive international incident and is really a source of tension between China and Japan today. And so I'm not going to get into this. If you're interested, of course, there's a lot of world history videos about this, and your world history class probably talked about this. But the collapse of Nanjing is going to lead to some pretty substantial atrocities. And in the end, the group that's most effective in fighting the Japanese are the communist cells, partially at least led by Mao Zedong. The communists had been used to fighting a guerrilla war against the nationalists, and so they're going to carry on that fight against the Japanese. And it's really not until the Xi'an incident, which, again, you should have talked about in your world history classes, that we start getting a united communist nationalist front against the Japanese, although even then, it's pretty tenuous. And so fighting back against the Japanese in China is problematic, under any circumstances. Images like this of the Shanghai railway bombing are going to build foreign support for this, and Franklin Roosevelt is going to give a quarantine speech arguing that we should quarantine and push back against Japan. But as far as what we're actually able to do to restrain the Japanese, there's really not a lot at this point. And so beyond funneling weapons into China, we'd have to more or less economically cut the Japanese off, which we could do, although it would hurt American business interests as well. And so that's sort of considered a last resort for us. In Europe, we're dealing with the problem of appeasement here. Hitler and his Nazi party had risen to power after the collapse of the economy of the Weimar Republic, when the Dawes Plan collapsed and the US sort of pushed back or withdrew a lot of its support. And so that's really problematic because, of course, Hitler is going to violate the Treaty of Versailles in a whole bunch of different ways. The Europeans, especially the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, are going to follow a policy of appeasement towards Hitler as he remilitarizes the Rhineland, completes the Anschluss with Austria, and begins to annex the Sudetenland. Again, this is all stuff that your world history class should have talked about, so I'm not going to go into tons of detail here. In Chamberlain's defense, Europe was not prepared for war. The economic sort of downturn that affected the United States was affecting the rest of the world, and a lot of modern historians give Chamberlain some credit for buying time against the Nazis as opposed to directly confronting them. But again, appeasement did not stop Hitler's advances, and he's going to continue aggressively annexing all of Czechoslovakia, leading to Dr. Seuss creating a lot of awesome cartoons arguing that we should not be continuing to appease Nazi Germany. So the Munich Conference was the conference in which the Europeans agreed to give up Czechoslovakia, despite the fact that it was, again, a complete violation of the Versailles Treaty, with the hope that Hitler would be done at this point. As far as mobilization goes, even before the war began in Europe, we understood that we could get drawn into war again. We remember, of course, how we got drawn into the Napoleonic Wars, with the War of 1812, and how we got drawn into World War I through the Lusitania incident and then eventually unrestricted submarine warfare. So instead, we're going to pass a policy in 1937 under Roosevelt called cash and carry, meaning that if there's Europe, if war happens in Europe, we're only going to sell non-military goods to the Europeans. They had to be purchased with cash. We're not going to go into, let Europe take out huge lines of credit here. And they had to be carried only on non-American vessels, with the hope being that this would prevent any future Lusitania sinking from pulling us into the war. This, of course, for critics of the Roosevelt administration and for people who felt like we should more aggressively pursue aggressive foreign policy, was going to hamper our war effort and hamper our allies. But at the same time, there was not the political will to fight a war in Europe again at this point. And so the Roosevelt administration really felt like they had their hands tied here. Especially after the invasion of Poland, as you hopefully again remember from your world history classes, Hitler and Stalin signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and arguing for a treaty of non-aggression between the Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany in exchange for the dividing up of Poland. With Poland divided up between the two sides, this was the line in the sand that the British had created. This means that England and France are going to declare war on Nazi Germany. Poland is going to vanish and be annexed into the two great sort of the fascist and communist powers. The Soviet Union is going to move into the Baltic states, and World War II is going to begin in earnest. As you hopefully remember from your world history classes, World War II took a very different course than World War I. Rather than devolving into trench warfare where you'd have these long battle lines all the way across France, France fell to the Nazi blitzkrieg with shocking speed. And very quickly, France was defeated and knocked out of the war. Northern France became a directly occupied zone, whereas southern France became sort of the Vichy Free France, the de facto, the free French government. And there was, obviously this was really problematic because now Hitler controls a significant amount of more territory in Europe, and it demonstrated sort of the versatility of Hitler's tanks and his blitzkrieg strategy. With France gone, all of a sudden now we feel like we have to step up our aid to Europe, or at least Roosevelt feels like he needs to step up our aid to Europe. Here's his Four Freedoms speech, where he lays out the basic principles that we'll be fighting for. But at the same time, he's still facing massive opposition at home. The America First movement is still alive and well, and the America First Committee is going to really create their own sort of political organization advocating against intervention in European wars. Some of this is for just peace purposes, general opponents of war in general. Some of this is from Nazi sympathizers, and some of it is just economic support or opposition to war, with the idea that, well, why can't we just do what we normally do and sell arms to people without going to war? And Dr. Seuss, of course, is arguing that eventually Nazi and Japanese aggression is going to drag us into the conflict, but at this point, there's really nothing that the United States has to fight for here, and so Charles Lindbergh becomes one of the largest advocates for the America First movement. We, of course, remember him as the hero who flew the first solo nonstop transatlantic flight. And Dr. Seuss is going to be one of the strongest advocates for intervention, drawing a lot of political cartoons like the ones you see here. So take a moment, pause, look at these, and then we'll move forward. In the end, because there's not enough support to go to war, the U.S. is going to pass a series of neutrality acts, which formally establishes that we are neutral and lays out very specific sort of conditions by which we can sell military supplies to the British, to the Chinese, to other groups who are fighting in World War II. But at the same time, we are going to start drafting people into the army, and we are going to, again, with cash and carry, find ways to sell military supplies to European and Asian countries. And so to some extent, we're neutral, but to some extent, we're not. In the election of 1940, the Democrats are going to run Roosevelt for a third time. This is clearly unprecedented, and we've never had a president win the presidency 3 times because, of course, of the precedent set by George Washington. There's some argument that the Republicans were making that Roosevelt would lead us into war. The Republicans are going to nominate Wendell Willkie, who ideologically is pretty much indistinguishable for Roosevelt. He's a liberal Republican, and so there's not really a sort of ideological difference between the two parties. In general, Roosevelt was maybe more aggressive about intervention, and Dr. Seuss, of course, is going to argue strongly against getting more involved in the war. So we see all of these fun sort of cartoons here. And Roosevelt is going to win, but by no means by as large a margin as he won in 1936. So we get Roosevelt elected to the presidency for the third time, for the first time ever. And and that means that, of course, we're going to expand our aid to Europe. We're going to move, because things are getting pretty dire for the British in 1940, we're going to move from cash and carry to lend-lease, in which we're going to play a much, much larger role in transporting military supplies to the British. This is going to greatly expand our aid to both Great Britain and then eventually the USSR, as Hitler is going to, once he launches his Operation Barbarossa. And so we're going to start providing more aid to Europeans and to Asians, although Dr. Seuss would again argue that we're not doing enough. And as we see here, for isolationists and for America Firsters, what they see is Roosevelt getting us into war without legally getting us into war. And so they argue that this is going to lead to exactly the same type of incidents that brought us into World War I, and that Roosevelt is more or less bringing us into this war. Even before we get into war, we're going to meet and sign the Atlantic Charter with England, which establishes our sort of aims for the post-war world, and again really establishes that although the US is neutral, we're not super neutral, and German submarines are going to start attacking American ships. American convoys are going to start fighting with Nazi submarines and Nazi ships in the Atlantic, and before you know it, we've got another undeclared naval war in the Atlantic with the Germans. And so it's pretty clear to everyone that although there is not yet the political will to declare war, there's no American blood on American soil moment. In general, the United States is clearly not completely neutral in this conflict. So here's Hamilton Fish arguing against Roosevelt pushing us into intervention, and we'll leave it there for now. When we come back for next unit, we'll lay out the beginnings of World War II, American mobilization and involvement in the war, and then in the aftermath of the First World War, the growing conflict with the Soviet Union, setting the stage for the Cold War and the rest of the 20th century. So for now, thank you for listening.